The city sparkled at night with its towers of glass and steel stretching upward as if they owned the sky. And in one of those towers sat Adrian Cole, a man whose name carried weight in boardrooms and whose presence commanded silence wherever he went. But behind the carefully polished surface of his life, his wife Elena lived a reality that was slowly suffocating her. Elena had once believed she was the luckiest woman in the world, married to a man whose ambition inspired millions and whose eyes once looked at her as if she was the very reason he breathed. She carried his child within her, a child she prayed would bring them closer together. Yet every passing day she could feel him slipping away, his heart no longer in their home but somewhere else, perhaps with someone else. She tried to ignore the late nights when the bed grew cold beside her, telling herself he was simply overworked, that the pressures of leading an empire required sacrifices, that his absences were temporary. But lies, even the ones we tell ourselves, eventually begin to crumble, and Elena began to notice the subtle changes that spoke louder than words. The way Adrian's phone always seemed to vibrate at odd hours, the way his eyes lit up when he spoke to Isabella, the first love who had suddenly returned to the city like a ghost from the past. Elena remembered the name because she had heard it whispered long before she married him. A woman who once shattered his heart but whom he never truly forgot. And though Elena had been the one to pick up the broken pieces and love him despite his scars, it seemed that when Isabella walked back into his life, the cracks in his heart opened again and Elena became invisible. She tried to fight it at first, to win him back with patience and kindness, to remind him of the vows they made under soft lights and delicate flowers, to remind him that she was carrying his legacy in her womb. But nothing she did seemed to matter anymore. She was 5 months pregnant when she saw them together for the first time, her hands trembling as she stood in the doorway of his office with documents she thought he needed. Adrian was leaning close to Isabella, his laughter softer, his eyes warmer, his hand brushing against hers as if no one else existed in the world. For a moment, Elena could not breathe, the sight piercing her like a blade. And when Isabella's smirk met her gaze, she understood that this was no innocent interaction, but a deliberate declaration that she was losing her husband. That night she confronted him with a gentle question, her voice breaking as she asked if he still loved her, and his silence told her more than any lie could. He reached for her hand, perhaps out of habit or pity, but the hesitation in his touch felt colder than ice, and she pulled away, retreating into the shadows of her own grief. From that night onward, the distance between them grew like an ocean, wide and merciless, and Elena found herself alone in a home that once echoed with laughter. She still set his dinner on the table each night, but the plates remained untouched. The food cold by the time she carried it back to the kitchen. She talked to her unborn baby in the quiet of her room, whispering stories and promises, pressing her hand against the tiny kicks that reminded her she was not entirely alone. But the loneliness clawed at her, the humiliation of being abandoned, while carrying the greatest gift she could give him, broke her in ways no words could describe. She endured it because she wanted her child to grow up with both parents, but fate had already decided otherwise.
The breaking point
Came on a rainy evening when Adrian returned home much later than usual, his suit carrying the faint scent of perfume that did not belong to her. She asked him softly if he had been with Isabella, and once again silence became his cruelest answer. In that silence, Elena heard the death of her marriage, the end of the love she had fought so hard to keep alive. Tears burned her eyes, but she did not cry in front of him, for she knew that her dignity was the last thing she could protect. That night, while he showered and prepared for bed as if nothing was wrong, she packed a single suitcase in the quiet of their bedroom, her hands trembling as she folded tiny clothes for the baby she had yet to meet. Every piece of fabric was soaked in her tears, yet every movement was fueled by determination. She had loved him with everything she had, but love could not survive in a place where it was not valued. She walked through the hallways of the mansion one last time, her footsteps echoing in the silence, her heart heavy with memories of laughter and stolen kisses, of whispered promises and dreams that would never come true. She paused by the nursery. She had decorated alone, running her fingers across the crib as if saying goodbye to the life she had imagined for her child. Then she lifted her suitcase, pressed a protective hand over her belly, and with a deep breath, walked out the front door into the cold night. The rain fell on her face, like the sky itself was weeping for her, but she did not look back. First time in her life she chose herself and the child she carried, leaving behind the man who had once been her world but who had now become her greatest heartbreak. Elena stepped into the world that night with nothing but her suitcase, her unborn child, and a heart that had been shattered into 1,000 pieces. And though the rain soaked her hair and blurred her vision, it could not wash away the fire that was beginning to flicker within her. At first, survival became her only goal, for she had walked away from luxury into a reality where every dollar mattered, where every door seemed to slam in her face, and where whispers followed her wherever. She went in whispers that called her foolish for leaving a man like Adrian, whispers that pitied her for carrying a child with no husband by her side. She rented a small room in an old neighborhood, the walls cracked and the windows drafty, but it was hers. And she held on to it with pride because it represented her first step toward independence. Days blurred into nights as she worked whatever jobs she could find, from cleaning offices after hours to assisting in small shops. Her swollen feet aching, her back sore, her body heavy with the weight of pregnancy, yet her spirit refused to collapse. She lived on little, saving every coin she could, eating less so her baby could have more. And each night, when she returned to that tiny room, she would sit by the window and whisper to the life inside her belly, promising her child that they would never be small, that one day they would rise above all of this. When her daughter, whom she named Aria, was born, Elena felt a new strength surge through her veins. For in those tiny eyes she saw a reason to keep fighting, a reason to never give up. Motherhood was not easy, especially alone, but Elena embraced it with every fiber of her being. She took Aria with her 2 jobs. She studied at night while rocking her to sleep. She taught herself about business, finance, and technology from free library books and online courses, refusing to let her mind be trapped by her circumstances. She knew Adrian had wealth and power, and Isabella had beauty and charm. But Elena had something far stronger: relentless will and the ability to endure storms until they turned into opportunities. Her first break came unexpectedly when she noticed inefficiencies in a small company where she worked as an assistant. Instead of staying silent, she used the knowledge she had been gathering to propose solutions that could save money and increase productivity. Her ideas caught the attention of the owner, who gave her more responsibility. And though she was paid little, she gained what she valued more than money at that moment: experience, exposure, and the belief that she could create value wherever she went. From there she moved on, each step bolder than the last, sometimes failing, sometimes being dismissed for daring to dream too big. But each rejection only fueled her hunger to prove herself. She began freelancing, consulting small businesses, and eventually saved enough to start her own small venture, a digital marketing firm she ran from her kitchen table while caring for Aria. The nights were endless, sacrifices many, but slowly. Her work began to attract clients, and slowly money began to flow. She was no longer the woman who left a mansion with nothing but tears. She was becoming a woman who built brick by brick her own foundation, one that no one could take away from her. As years passed, her business grew, and with every challenge she faced, she grew sharper, tougher, and more fearless. When doors closed, she built her own. When people doubted her, she let her results speak louder than words. She expanded into e-commerce, then into real estate, and with each step her wealth multiplied. Yet despite her growing success, Elena remained humble, never forgetting the nights she had gone hungry so her daughter could eat, never forgetting the loneliness of walking away from a loveless home, never forgetting the humiliation of being cast aside. Those memories became her fuel, her silent motivation. And soon people in the city began to speak her name with admiration rather than pity. She became a figure of inspiration, the woman who had been abandoned and yet rose to build an empire larger than the one she had left behind. Meanwhile, Adrian's world was not as perfect as it seemed. The glow of Isabella's return began to fade as reality set in. She was beautiful, yes, but selfish, demanding, and manipulative. And though Adrian tried to ignore the signs, cracks began to appear in their so-called paradise. Competitors grew fiercer, and Adrian often found himself distracted, haunted by the memory of Elena's departure. Though his pride would never allow him to admit it, he did not know that while he struggled to keep his empire steady, Elena was quietly building hers, investing wisely, expanding strategically, and surrounding herself with people who valued her not because of her last name, but because of her vision. Aria grew into a bright young girl, her laughter filling Elena's once empty home, and Elena made sure she never felt the absence of a father. She became both mother and father, provider and protector, showing her daughter through actions. That strength was not measured by the presence of a man, but by the resilience of a woman. There were still nights Elena cried quietly, still moments when loneliness pressed against her chest like a heavy weight, but she never let it define her. Instead, she let her pain sharpen her focus, turning every wound into wisdom, every setback into fuel. After nearly a decade of relentless work, Elena's net worth crossed into billions, her companies spanning across industries, her influence reaching circles that once shut their doors in her face. She became a force to be reckoned with, the woman whose name appeared on magazine covers, whose story inspired millions of women to rise from their own ashes. Yet in her heart she remained grounded, remembering always the small, cracked room where she once whispered promises to her unborn baby, remembering always the night she walked away from the mansion with nothing but faith. Her journey was not about revenge, it was about transformation, about becoming the woman she was always meant to be. Still, fate has a way of weaving threads back together, and the day came when her path and Adrian's would cross again. A prestigious charity gala was announced, one attended by the city's most powerful, and for the first time in years, Elena's name appeared on the guest list beside Adrian's. Rumors spread like wildfire, speculations filling the air about what would happen when the abandoned wife who became a billionaire stood face to face with the man who had once ignored her. On the night of the gala, as Elena stepped out of her car in a gown that shimmered under the lights, cameras flashed, reporters whispered, and the world turned its eyes toward her. She walked into that grand hall not as Adrian's forgotten wife, not as the woman who had left in tears, but as Elena Cole, the billionaire, the empire builder, the woman whose strength could not be denied. And as Adrian stood across the room, his glass trembling slightly in his hand as he caught sight of her, the reality hit him with the force of a storm. The woman he had once ignored had become greater than he could ever imagine. And though the night was filled with music and chatter, he heard only the silence of his own regret as their eyes met for the first time in nearly a decade. The gala sparkled with chandeliers and crystal glasses clinking in rhythm with polite laughter, a symphony of wealth and power gathering under one roof. Yet all eyes seemed to turn toward the woman who had just entered. Elena Cole, though she no longer carried the name with a trace of dependence or fragility, but with a quiet confidence that made even the most powerful men pause. She walked with grace, her gown flowing like liquid gold, her daughter Aria beside her, now a poised young girl whose presence reflected the strength of the woman who had raised her. Conversations hushed, whispers filled the air, and the press cameras flashed endlessly, because the story of Elena was no longer just gossip in hushed corners. It had become legend, the abandoned wife who had left with nothing and returned with everything, the woman whose empire now rivaled the one she once shared with Adrian. Adrian stood across the hall, his glass trembling slightly in his hand. The sight of Elena hitting him harder than any business failure ever had. Isabella clung to his arm, her smile brittle, her eyes narrowing with envy. For she too could feel the shift in the room, the way people gravitated toward Elena, the way respect radiated toward her like light, while she herself was treated as a mere accessory to Adrian. For a long moment, Adrian did not move, unable to process how the woman he once ignored, the woman he thought would be crushed without him, now stood taller than ever, her beauty magnified not just by appearance but by the aura of power and resilience that surrounded her. Their eyes met across the crowd, and Elena did not flinch, did not lower her gaze, for she had no reason to hide anymore. She remembered every tear she had shed, every night of loneliness, every humiliation she had endured, but now all of that felt distant, like a story that belonged to someone else, because she was no longer that broken woman. She was Elena, the billionaire, the mother who had raised her daughter into strength, the empire builder who had taught herself to stand on her own. Slowly, Adrian made his way toward her, each step heavy with the weight of his regrets, and when he finally stood before her, the room seemed to hold its breath. "Elena," he said softly, his voice carrying more hesitation than authority. And she simply nodded in acknowledgement, offering him nothing more than the courtesy one gives to a stranger. Isabella's grip on his arm tightened, as if to remind him of her presence, but Adrian's eyes never left Elena. "You look extraordinary," he added, but she smiled politely, the kind of smile that carried no warmth, only civility, and replied, "Thank you. Success has a way of transforming people." The words stung him more than she could ever know, because behind them lay the truth he had ignored, while he had chased after a ghost from his past. She had built a future brighter than his own. Conversations around them began to resume, but the weight of their reunion lingered in the air, drawing subtle glances from onlookers who whispered about the irony of fate. Adrian tried to start again, speaking of old times, of mistakes, of wanting to talk privately, but Elena remained calm, composed, her answers short and formal. She was not here for him. She was here for herself, for her daughter, for the world that now recognized her worth. Later that evening, as the gala reached its peak and the stage was opened for speeches, Elena was called upon as a keynote speaker, her story chosen to inspire. She walked up the steps with Aria's proud eyes following her, and when she took the microphone, the hall fell into silence. She spoke not of betrayal or revenge, but of resilience, of how pain can be a seed that grows into power, how a woman does not need to be defined by who she loves or who abandons her, but by who she chooses to become. Her words struck deep into every listener's heart, but none more than Adrian's, who stood frozen at his table, his chest tightening with the realization that, while he had sought validation from fleeting affection, Elena had created a legacy that would outlast them all. Isabella shifted uncomfortably, her beauty dimming under the shadow of Elena's brilliance. And for the first time, Adrian saw the stark difference between the two women. One had been a distraction, a memory he foolishly clung to, while the other had been his true partner, the one he failed to cherish, the one he lost forever. When the applause thundered through the hall, Elena smiled. Not for the crowd, but for herself and her daughter. Because in that moment she knew she had finally closed the chapter of her past. After the event, Adrian approached her once more, his voice tinged with desperation this time, asking for another chance for forgiveness, for a place in her life again. But Elena looked at him with steady eyes and said the words that would forever define their ending. "Adrian, for your love no longer exists. I left her behind the night I walked out of your house. What stands before you now is someone who learned to live without you, who learned that love starts with self-respect. I wish you well, but I do not need you. Not now, not ever." Her voice was calm, not cruel, but it cut deeper than any anger ever could because it was final. Adrian's shoulders sank as reality crashed down on him, and Isabella, sensing her fading relevance, excused herself with a bitter glare, leaving him alone in the crowd. Elena turned away, joining her daughter, who slipped her hand into hers, and whispered, "I'm proud of you, Mama," words that filled Elena's heart more than any applause or title ever could. As they left the gala, cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions. But Elena paid them no mind, for she knew the true victory was not in the headlines, but in the quiet knowledge that she had risen above, that she had built a life on her own terms. The mansion she once left behind was just a memory. The man she once loved was just a lesson. But the future that lay ahead was hers to shape, bright and unyielding. In that moment, walking out into the cool night air with her daughter by her side, Elena felt a peace she had never known before. She had closed the circle, turned her pain into power, and written an ending that was not of loss, but of triumph, not of sorrow, but of strength. And as the city lights glimmered around her, Elena knew with absolute certainty that she had not just survived, she had conquered.